So today we are so excited and having a great pleasure to have Rasmia and Kirmani Frye in our DSI gathering. So Rasmia Kirmani Frye is a dependent consultant focusing on the urban problem solving, the housing, movement building, and strategic planning. And as a radical optimist, Rasmia envisions a general perception of public housing from an often ignored problem into a critical, valuable asset for New York City. And one of her brilliant work is the Fund for Public Housing, where she served as the first president to reimagine and improve the way public housing in New York City works. And we are so inspired by her strong narrative in the public housing impact, her sustainable and growing mind on public housing and urban planning, and how she believes in the community resilience. And we think that you would also be interested in her achievement, perspectives, and leaderships in the public housing community and also urban planner and innovator community. And hope that from her practices, we able to envision our works in cities we are living. And I will pass to Mickey to talk about more.
Sherry, thanks so much. So Rasmia, we're so happy that you could join us. And many of us were able to change our Zoom backgrounds to just show our deep and fierce commitment to public housing, which we know that you are such a strong champion of. And I did want to share a small personal note with the rest of the class, which is that I've had an opportunity to meet Rasmia before this global guest lecture. And she has really shifted my own understanding of the ways that public housing works. And also the fact that it's such a big system, both in New York City, but also globally, that so many people feel like it is immovable and unable, right, to make change around. But for us as social designers and people committed to thinking about what justice and equity looks like beyond this current world and this current system, I've really been inspired by the ways that Rasmia thinks about and reimagines this space through trust building, looking at the roots of what public housing means to families and to communities, and then the commitment to long-term sustained action. And so Rasmia, so excited to welcome you to this DSI space, which is a new home for some of us on this call and a blooming home for some of us who have been in the program for our second year now. But we're so excited to welcome you and also to just kick us off in this conversation. And so because we know that you believe in community building, we wanted to do this intro a little bit differently. So before we pass it over to you, Sherry and I, hopefully you can see us all now. Sherry and I have some quick questions, kind of like rapid fire questions to kick us off. And so if you want to just take yourself off mute, we have 5 questions and then we'll pass it over to you to just share your brilliance. So first question in the rapid fire is, what is your favorite place in New York City?
Okay, first of all, hi everybody. So good to be here. So good to see so many faces. Let's see. My favorite place in New York City. So I have to think about, I'm asked this often and I pick a different one every time. And today we are going to Queens. We're going to Jackson Heights. And my favorite place is a place called Kebab King in Jackson Heights. That's my favorite place in New York for kebabs, and I love it because the upstairs like dining area looks like the house I grew up in, looks like all my aunts and uncles' houses, and I feel very at home there.
Wow, that's great. Thank you for your recommendations. So the second question is, what was your favorite class in the college?
Oh, college, like undergraduate college, like decades ago. Let's see. Well, fun story is that I started college as an opera major. But I realized very, very quickly that the like diva thing is very real with opera singers, and I'm not a diva. So I switched naturally, to urban studies. My favorite course was actually, this is going to sound really nerdy, but we're all in school, was my senior thesis class, where the school that I went to, which was in rural Ohio, the reason I chose it is because it had a really strong undergraduate thesis program where you could do your own research on any topic that you wanted and apply for a grant. And it was a 2-year process. And so my thesis was on the transition of Soho, New York City, from industrial to artist community and art as a social movement. And it was my favorite class. Was that independent work with the professor and my own research and coming to New York and talking to people. And yep, that was my favorite.
Amazing. Learning new things about you already. What is a food that reminds you of home?
Well, the most comforting, so for folks, my family's from India and Pakistan, and the most comforting, deep comfort is khichdi. And everybody has their version of khichdi, but khichdi is basically dal, rice, butter, whatever your family puts in it, but that is the most comforting. Coming in at number 2 for me would be a fried egg with paratha. So those 2 things, those remind me of home the most.
Wow. So I would like to try it once, but yeah. So if you could travel anywhere in the world, where would you go?
My goodness. If I could travel anywhere in the world, so I'm going to have to put my, hopefully there are no Kirmanis watching. I'm going to have to put my family on hold for a minute. And I would say, I would like to go to Sao Paulo, Brazil. I've never been to Brazil, it's, I love cities. Mexico City is another one. I haven't been, which I'm deeply ashamed that I haven't been to Mexico City. So I think those two places I would really love to go.
Yeah, great space.
Amazing. And last question in rapid fire, Rasmia, is what's a playlist or podcast that you're listening to right now?
Let's see. I'm such a my friends send me all of these playlists. I'm such a derelict. I haven't listened to podcasts. I'm behind on my podcast listening. Which I get made fun of all the time, that people refer to things and I have no idea what they're talking about. Let's see, the playlist that I am currently listening, I know, the playlist I'm currently listening to, and it switches up during the day, I'm sure for all of us, as we're just inside all the time, or I'm a runner, so when I'm running, is old school reggae has been for the last 3 days. That'll shift out. I'll get sick of it. I'll move on to something else. But for the last 3 days, and then yes, Mickey just put in the chat. There is a song. I have to look it up right now, or else I'm gonna get it wrong. But I do love Missy Elliott, and there is a mashup that she did with, well, the song is called Don't Judge Me. Has anybody heard the song, Don't Judge Me, with Missy Elliott? I think that's about all the information I can give you. Oh yeah, so it's Kiara Sheard is the writer of the song and the main singer, and she did a mix with Missy Elliott, and I feel like that is like my anthem and everybody's anthem is Don't Judge Me. I'm doing my thing. You don't have to like it. You don't have to get on board, but I'm going to keep doing it and don't judge me. So that's been my song of the pandemic.
Thank you so much. And we dropped the link to listen to Don't Judge Me after class. Maybe that could be our outro dance party. But Rasmia, we're so excited to welcome you. And I feel like that song is a perfect segue for you to share your unapologetic commitment, love and care and radical optimism that you bring to this work. And we're all really excited to hear from you.
Great. So I have like not one note, so I'm just gonna talk. And I would encourage folks to, you know, if you have questions, both about public housing and perhaps my career or your own or design or innovation from my perspective, I really look forward to hearing from you. So, just Vicky, what you asked if this was right in the Kahoot. So just one correction from the Kahoot. So the question was 1 in blank people live in public housing in New York City, and the correct answer, it's still huge. The correct answer is 1 in 14. 1 in 14 New Yorkers lives in public housing. It's still an enormous number, and Mickey knows this, and I'll share this little tidbit now, and then I'll go back to like my story, is that, listen, so much of like public housing advocacy, public housing work is about the narrative and perception of public housing. And this is true all over, not actually all over the world. There's a specific perception in the United States of people who live in public housing. And there's a specific perception of people in New York City of people who live in public housing. And that perception, this is not totally across the board, but I would argue that it's pretty prevalent, is for people who, New Yorkers, like, most know what public housing is. It's the most visible and invisible infrastructure in New York City, I think, because it's so much of it is very easily identifiable. It's huge, but the assumption of most New Yorkers, if they're even thinking about public housing and public housing residents, is that it's like those people over there, usually Black and brown people, those people over there who are not working, collecting welfare, high crime, nobody's working. That's the perception. It's 100% false. So I constantly have been thinking about how do you change the narrative of public housing? And when you're talking to New Yorkers, and I'll go back to why that's false, but when you're talking to New Yorkers, and I love skeptics, room full of skeptics, favorite audience, people who think they know stuff when they don't have any idea. I love those people, only because it's gives me such a thrill when they're proven wrong. So the thing is that, so there are about 180,000 units of public housing in New York City. And when you tell New Yorkers that something is big, it doesn't mean anything, because like everything is big in New York City. Your pizza is big, your soda that you get to go with your pizza is big. So like, telling New Yorkers that, thank you, Mickey, like telling New Yorkers that public housing is big, people are like, and? So when I was beginning kind of really getting in front of different audiences to talk about public housing, I knew that I had to paint a different picture about size. So 1 in 14 New Yorkers live, first of all, 180,000 units of housing. NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, is the largest residential landlord in the country. That helps people shift a little bit. Then they start to like, one in 14 New Yorkers lives in public housing, relies on NYCHA for home. So like, what does that mean? That's like pre-COVID, standing on a corner waiting to cross the street. There's like definitely 14 people there. Every time you're on a bus, every time, like that is a lot of people. And another way to get New Yorkers and anyone to really understand public housing is that, okay, so it's 1 in 14 people, it's 500,000 New Yorkers, basically. And, you know, the top 3 employers, this goes to your Kahoot quiz question, the top 3 employers of public housing residents in New York are the New York Police Department, the Department of Education, and NYCHA itself. The top 9 out of 10 employers of public housing residents are all of the public systems that New York City relies on. So public housing residents are frontline workers. If public housing didn't exist, the political economy of New York City would collapse. That is not an exaggeration. That is for real, for real. And in New York, and I do this with audiences live, I usually ask people, how many people love or believe in good public education? Like, even if you hate kids, you know that like a good public education is like a good thing, right? Who loves public transportation? Well, we love to hate it in New York. And I always kind of make the joke that when I worked at the Housing Authority, my husband has spent 35 years at the MTA, at the Transit Authority. And like, we would go to parties and just like not tell anybody what we did, because the complaint lines would form immediately. I'm kidding. We always tell people what we did. But in New York City, people love to hate on public transportation, but because everybody relies on it. But public art, public parks, public libraries, New Yorkers value these public systems. People do not value public housing the same way they value other systems with the word public in front of it. And why is that? Well, it's because of the misperceptions I talked about before, because people who live in public housing must be the undeserving poor, because of white supremacy, because of years and years of systemic oppression. Like, but all of the people who live, not all, but I just gave you the list of where the people who live in public housing, where they work. They make the city run. So I think that framing it that way for people helps them begin to understand that public housing has value. And then a little other data points that like it's 11% of public housing residents collect cash welfare. That's it. 11%, not 50%, not 80%, not 20%, not 30%. So these narratives, these dominant narratives are false. They are just simply not true. And so let me back up a little bit, and then I'll talk a little bit more about public housing and kind of what I've been working on and the value of public housing, and how those narratives are perpetuated by continued white supremacy and systemic racism and oppression. But I also want to say this about narrative too, that it's really, really important that when we are talking about place, we are talking about people, we're talking about communities and neighborhoods, and we'll do that more, I'll do that more. That's also the dominant narrative about specifically like poor communities of color, public housing community, is that like everybody is in turmoil all the time, right? Like that's the dominant narrative. Things must be effed up all the time. It's misery. And that is too an incredible amount of racism and classism, because it does not at all acknowledge joy or love or celebration or of families, or that things are just like normal everywhere. And yes, as I also used to start, and I'll talk about this when I worked in Brownsville, Brooklyn for a decade. And that all the stuff written about Brownsville, when it was written about, which was like rare, that was the narrative, right? Like everything is horrible all the time. And that the dominant narrative about anything generally is not created by the people who are experiencing it or the people who are experts in it. It's created by outside people. So that the subversive narrative is actually the dominant narrative, right? So the secondary narrative, which is the narrative of the people who own the space, who live in the space, that's the dominant narrative. And let me tell you, like, yes, all of the data about Brownsville and crime, yes, all of that data is true. And also, people are everywhere are not monolithic. People experience joy and love and celebration and hard times. And it does not take away the things that we need to fight against or the things that need to change. What it is it is much easier to dehumanize the people and also make them separate if the narrative is not inclusive of the like totality of emotion and experience that makes up humanity. It's much easier to pathologize a community or a population or a group of people if you cannot imagine that, you know, some days in any community, people are like sitting around and eating cake, like, or playing or laughing. And then the critique from many folks come in, which is, well, why are they sitting around eating cake, enjoying anything? Shouldn't they be out looking for work? How dare they have love and joy and celebration? So this is a much larger construct, I think, of the world that and many communities in the world, and whoever is the patriarch makes this kind of narrative assumptions. And certainly that's true in New York. Certainly that's true in communities in New York City, and folks who write about communities in New York City, and folks who design the systems that regulate interaction and behavior and the way that people live, which we will talk about because you are designers, and we could for sure use some new systems. So a little bit about me, so you know my background, besides the fact that I like don't sing opera anymore and I love kitschy, is that I grew up outside of Boston in the 70s. So I'm 47. And Boston is a really interesting place. And it certainly, it has, we experienced a lot of racism, and Boston does have a binary, a black and white binary. So if you're, and that's still, that narrative is true and it still exists. But I grew up kind of in this like bubble of other Pakistani families, and we just kind of moved around in a bubble. People didn't really know what to make of us, do with us. So we just were like with each other. My dad is the oldest of 6. He was the first one to immigrate, and I grew up with all of my aunts and uncles and cousins and everybody all around. I was the first of the kids. There were 15 cousins. I was the first Kirmani kid to leave Massachusetts to go to college. Everybody had a heart attack, thought that I would become like, I don't know what, but like not talk to anyone anymore. Like I'm sure there are many of you who have experienced something similar. That didn't happen. It was wonderful. It paved the way for other Kirmani kids to go and do stuff. But I knew I wanted to live in New York probably from when I was like 11. I just had this idea that, you know, that I could be both seen and anonymous at the same time in New York. And I think even as a young kid, that really appealed to me. As much as I love my family, the notion of privacy just absolutely did not exist. And so going somewhere where I could be who I wanted to be, and that could change every day, was so appealing to me. And so I went to college, as I said, in rural Ohio, like God knows why, I don't know. I loved it. It was called the College of Worcester. It's really tiny. It's like not, people have never heard of it. And I'm always like, oh, well, it's like not Oberlin. It's not Kenyon. It's the other one that nobody's heard of. But I loved it. And then 2 months after graduating from college, I moved to New York. And this was like pre-internet, pre-like anything. I had to like look in the paper for a job and mail out letters. And so I got a job working with an organization then called ACORN, the Association for Community Organizations for Reform Now, as an organizer in Flatbush. And I will tell you straight up, it lasted 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And not because, and I say this because I think it's so important that we are okay with shifting, doing what we want to do. And it's an incredible privilege to be able to do that. I didn't come from privilege, but I'd never quit anything in my whole life. And I didn't know what to do. And the reason why I didn't like it, and this is about communities, is that while I agreed with ACORN's general philosophy, their way of organizing was door knocking and getting people to donate money to join ACORN, join campaigns. But we were in a poor Black community in New York City. I'm not Black. I'm not from the community. And who the hell am I to be knocking on doors, asking people to give money? Right? It's just, I get it in the long game, but it did not, I'm not your girl. Like, it did not sit well with me. I didn't know what to do. So I did it for a couple days. I knew immediately that this was not going to work for me. And I wasn't going to work for them. It wasn't going to be good for them. So I brought a book to work every day and sat in a cafe for 8 hours. I didn't know what to do. I'd never quit anything before. So I called my mom from a payphone and she said, well, this is why you took typing. Like, I love you, but like, figure it out. So, and then of course she like immediately came to New York after being so hard on me. What I did was then I took a job as a receptionist at the then very fledgling organization called the Times Square Business Improvement District. This was in 1994, 95. I don't know if any of you have heard of business improvement districts or BIZ, but they are a quasi-governmental nonprofit organization that basically like subsidizes city services in communities. So enhanced sanitation, enhanced kind of safety, lots of public events. But the income that bids get are based on property taxes from the bid community. So you can imagine that like a Times Square business improvement district has a much different budget than like the Pitkin Avenue business improvement district in Brownsville. So it's not equitable. But Times Square at the time was fascinating. Was super not what it is right now. What I learned from that job, I loved it. And it was not as progressive or radical as I am or was, but what I really learned, and I think it's important for this conversation and any conversation on kind of career stuff, is that good ideas can come from anywhere. So I had a boss, Gretchen Dykstra, and I will say 25 years later, that crew at the Times Square bid were all still in touch with each other, every single person. But Gretchen taught me that I was the receptionist, and if I had an idea about something, I could speak up and that idea could become adopted. So I was super lucky that at such a young age, and I also made copies, got coffee, lit her cigarettes. I mean, I did whatever anybody asked me to do, but at the same time, back then you could smoke in buildings, just PS. I'm not saying it was a good thing, but it certainly did happen. But that I could have a good idea and carry it through. So I wanted to do an inventory of all the sex shops in Times Square. There were a ton back then, and not just because I wanted to count the number, but because so many young people were being exploited in sex shops, and that was a story that wasn't being told. Like there were lots of stories about don't change Times Square, freedom of expression, don't close the sex shops. And on the one hand, I can really understand that. On the other hand, there was a story not being told about underage, really boys and girls being exploited in sex shops. So like what is the counter narrative to a dominant narrative happening? And that has really become a theme of mine, I think, throughout my career is like really being able to figure out and know what the dominant narrative is, and then what is the work to create a new dominant narrative based on the experience of actual people experiencing like the thing. And then how do you use that new narrative, or what I would call the actual dominant narrative, to propel change, policy change, create advocacy, do campaign organizing. So much of it is steeped in that narrative. And as an organizer, which I was for a long time, that part of my job is to just like sit the hell down and be quiet and let experts, who are the people who live in communities, tell that story. And my job is to help connect that story to other resources and other places. So let me just continue with this. And Mickey, you just got to tell me when to shut up, because you know I will go on and on and on. Okay. After Times Square, I went to work for an organization that has a very, very benign sounding name. It's called Partnerships for Parks, which sounds like, oh man, you guys plant flowers, like that's so cute. That's not what it is. It was, again, an organization that had just begun. People thought it was crazy. It was embedded in city government. It was a nonprofit city government partnership to really do open space advocacy with communities. And the truth is that for so many people in New York City and other cities around the world who are not like going to some far-flung place for vacation, open space are places of respite, beauty, deep hangout, celebration. And so many communities in New York City at that time, and still true, but really didn't have access to their parks or public spaces and didn't feel ownership of their parks and public spaces. So my job was to help connect residents who wanted to their public spaces in a deep community organizing, deep listening, deep hanging out. I use the phrase deep hanging out a lot. It is the number one tenet for me in organizing and doing any work in any form is you gotta just hang out and shut up, but just talk to people deep hanging out. So there is this really jerky anthropologist named Clifford Geertz, super old. I think he's dead. This was in like the early 1900s. But this is one of his terms, deep hanging out. And so I don't like him. I love the phrase, and I use it all the time. And so what that job was that's how I really got to know Brooklyn and Brooklyn communities. And this will come up when I talk a little bit about Brownsville. So I was doing this kind of open space organizing on the south side of Williamsburg, Greenpoint, Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, East New York, Brownsville, Flatbush, and loved it, and learned so much from people, and fell in love with Brownsville, Brooklyn. Brownsville, Brooklyn And again, that job was very much about reshaping a narrative of open space, reshaping a narrative about, you know, parks not just as like cute and fun, but essential. And the environmental justice movement in New York had just recently then begun kind of really taking off. So I fell in love with Brownsville, but at the same time, I was ready to go back to school. And so I got my master's at the New School in urban and public policy. And what I really focused on there was how can community organizing affect policy change, or can it, or what's the relationship between those two things? And this carried over into my doctoral work, which I'll talk about in a sec, and because the literatures don't match. Okay, 10 minutes. I'm cutting out a lot of stuff. I'm going straight into public housing. Okay, graduate school, got my master's, terrific. Entered the doctoral program, somewhat terrific. I did all my, I'm ADD, so I'm all but dissertation. I have 2 chapters left of my dissertation, but that was like 10 years ago. We can like call my dad right now and ask him how he feels about that. He asked me about it every time we talk on the phone, every time we talk on the phone for 10 years. Yeah, it's a joke, and he's hilarious. But he's also not joking. Like, don't be fooled. But the reason why I didn't finish my dissertation, I'm proud that I didn't finish. I will finish it at some point, but I don't need it. I'm not going into academia. Is that as I was writing my dissertation, I got a phone call that basically said, Rasmia, we've heard you talk about Brownsville for like ever. We're tired of it. There's something going on there. There's a new organization, new something happening. Like, could you just go there? And so I literally closed my laptop and went to meet this guy, Greg Jackson, Jocko, who's the mayor of Brownsville. He died 6 years ago. Was the hardest death I've ever been through. Harder than my grandparents, harder. We were like family. And Greg, my interview with Greg, I know I only have 10 minutes, but I think it's important because for everyone to know when you know something, you feel something, you just like to do it. Greg, my interview with Greg from the community, I walked into the room. Greg used to play for the NBA. He played for the Knicks and the Phoenix Suns. He's a really big dude. I walked into the room, he looked at me, and he just started laughing. Well, like, okay, I don't know what's happening. So I just went up to him and I gave him a hug. And he gave me a hug and he said, okay. He said, okay, girl, you're from Brownsville, let's go. And that was it. End of the story. We worked together for 10 years. So we built an organization, or he built, and I was like, he was like the Wizard of Oz, like in front of everyone, and I was like the dork behind the curtain, like making sure that everything was happening, right? So Greg and I built this organization called the Brownsville Partnership together, which was, we didn't have these fancy words at the time, but you may have heard of it. It was a collective impact effort to kind of design a system built by the community that was responding to what residents in Brownsville needed and wanted, and about their self-determination. There was a lot of design that went into this. I'm talking like drawing things, drawing systems. Those systems didn't work, redrawing them, changing the staffing. It was a big experiment, but not experimenting with people's lives. There's a difference there. It was directed by the community. And Brownsville, back to public housing, has the largest concentration of public housing in North America in its geographical space. So like Queensbridge is the biggest single public housing development. Brownsville, most concentrated. We duke it out with Red Hook, but I think Brownsville wins. And as I was in Brownsville and really got to know people, became so clear to me once again that this whole theme about narrative and systems that are designed to oppress, really, they're so hard to change. And it doesn't mean they can't be changed. I mean, this is the radical opposite. You can change anything. It may take a long time, but you can change anything. But they are really by design, designed not to change, right? That's bureaucracy. They're these big Kafkaesque systems that I think, you know, the government thinks that they're doing, this is what makes it so complex. The government thinks that they're doing a good thing. And in many, many instances, government is. It just doesn't evolve and does not change with communities as they change. And as a result, and because we don't value public housing the way we value other things, it doesn't get the investment that other systems get. And I'm not saying that the education system, transportation system are like well invested in and perfect, but public housing is very, very, very complicated in its funding structure and its design. And so, oh my God, there's so much to say, but I'm gonna wrap it up, after 10 years in Brownsville, I did the unthinkable, which is that I went to work for the New York City Housing Authority. And I asked my friends in Brownsville, people who I trust, if that would be okay. Like, would they still trust me if I went to work for the Housing Authority? And listen, you just met me. I'm telling you right now, had they overwhelmingly said no, I would not have gone. My relationship with them far outweighs doing that. But what I got was an overwhelming, like, please go. So I went. I was there for 5 years, almost 5 years. It was fascinating. I'd never worked for government. And I also felt like, listen, if I'm going to be this huge critique of a system, like, let me go see what is happening. And it's still uncomfortable for me to say this because I'm such a flat, non-hierarchical person, but I will say it. And I think there's a whole conversation about women of color and owning our power that I'm still like dealing with, and as many of us are. But I sat on the executive team at the Housing Authority. So there are 12,000 employees, and there are 18 of us who ran the agency. This is a big leap for me. And so I ran the Office of Public-Private Partnerships, which is basically like how my job was to help NYCHA, the agency in public housing, be much more external and also more connected with the rest of the city. And you heard me from my beginning talking points that New Yorkers don't feel connected to public housing. And so how do you do that? How do you create relationships and partnerships? How do you help NYCHA kind of like get over itself? The analogy I always use is that NYCHA like sees itself as this like awkward, gangly teenager at a dance, like in the corner, hoping nobody will dance with them. And the rest of the city, including City Hall, sees itself as the like hotshot on campus and is like, thank God, because you're a mess. I don't want to dance with you. And we need everybody and all these systems to get over themselves and start like dancing with each other and coming together. And so how do you do that? And how you do that, I have kind of discovered, and this is not discovered, that's annoying. I have leaned into, found that it really is about creating unlikely partnerships, unlikely relationships, really sitting in discomfort, which people do not like to do, systems do not like to do, and creating that kind of container and environment to kind of come together and move forward. And so it got me thinking in terms of design about the difference between networks and organizations. And networks are, and there's a whole body of literature on network theory and network design, but networks really are able to keep purpose at the center. While organizations often keep like leaders at the center, short-term ideas at the center, structure at the center, like really committed to the organizational structure, even if it doesn't work. In networks, how do you get multi-sector people, including organizations, systems, and people at the effect of all of these things? How do you get them to be part of a single network where purpose is at the center, and then really weave the relationships so that that purpose becomes manifested? This is not, it's not trickery, and it's not like closing your eyes and wishing and hoping. And it's not wishy-washy. It takes an incredible amount of work to get institutions, people, individuals to stick around, to figure out big, big, big change. And with public housing, and then I'll stop talking, one of the biggest issues, yes, it's infrastructure, yes, it's buildings, just so we are clear, public housing in New York City is not baselined in the New York City budget. It is not part of the New York City budget. Let me say that again. Public housing in New York City, and this is true of every city except maybe San Francisco, is that public housing is not part of a city budget, because public housing is federally funded predominantly. So it takes an act of Congress to fund public housing. So one can imagine that as the political things change, that changes how public housing is funded. So currently, the New York City Housing Authority has a $30 billion capital budget gap. That means it would take about $30 billion, 32, maybe it's 40 or 50 now. That's how much it would cost to get rid of all the repair backlogs in public housing. Let's just put that in perspective, okay? So clearly the system is not working. And then how does that show up for people experiencing the system? I think the biggest issue with public housing is this trust deficit between public housing residents and the system. And I think it is, it is like the most classically codependent relationship ever. So public housing residents, and I'm making I realize right now I'm making very general and dramatic statements. So take it as that. It is meant to be that. Public housing residents often, I think, hate, fear, and depend on the housing authority. And I think the housing authority often hates, fears, and depends on residents. So how do you build anything if that's the relationship? How do you begin to deal with the trust erosion that exists within these systems? And so I think we can do that. I think it will take a long time, but you've got to do it, I think, in this networked approach, and not in where the purpose is clear and at the center, and the relationships are managed and the goals are articulated to get to that change. But nothing will change if we don't deal with the trust. And so I'm working on several projects that are like that, but I want to open it up for questions, so I'll stop talking, but I'm happy to talk about my current projects that are exactly this. One deals with the pandemic. So there's a COVID-19 citywide working group that I started with the Ford Foundation and some other people, and it's a network, and it's hard and awesome. And then there'll be 3 national networks, and building out a larger container for all of those kind of transformative public housing work. But, listen, public housing ain't sexy. It is to me. But to the world, I think we still are in a place where that narrative really has to, it really, really has to change.